Well, welcome everybody. On behalf of WRI's Ross Center Prize for Cities, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us today for Can Projects Ignite Citywide Change? Designing, Delivering, and Tracking Transformative Urban Projects. And we hope to make this session as interactive as possible. And we'd like to ask you all to please use your chat function today. We'll be monitoring that space, so please feel free to type your comments and your questions. And in the spirit of knowing who's with us, would everyone just take a moment just to use their chat button to say hello and to let us know where you're joining us from? And then also, it would be fantastic if you could leave your cameras on. That way we'll be able to respond to you and we'll be able to see each other throughout the call. So with that, we have 32 participants with us. And again, please say hello to us in the chat function. Let us know where you're from. Make sure that works. And please, if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, just put them in the chat for us and we'll be sure to respond to you. So with that, I would definitely like to pass over to my colleague, Anne.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you. I'm Anne. I'm the global lead for the Prize for Cities at WRI, and just really warm welcome to familiar faces and people we haven't met yet, and some that we haven't seen in a while in person, at least. So it's always great to see you online again. So before we get deep into this interesting question, as Chris was saying, can projects ignite citywide change? I just want to give you a few words of context for how this session came about. I guess the first thing probably to say is that this session was proposed under the umbrella of the WRI's Prize for Cities. This is our award for urban excellence. So this is a recognition award that WRI is running now for the third time. And for those not familiar with the prize, just a couple of words about it. It's a recognition award with kind of money, with no strings attached. It's just based on rewarding excellence. $250,000 for one grand prize winner. One of these is we are honored to have among us today. Maybe we'll hear from her later, no pressure though. And 4 runners up who received $25,000. So our criteria are, big ideas, life-changing impacts and ripple effects, which speaks to the question that we're looking for today. How do projects become good and impactful and also start to have impact beyond their own project boundary? WRI isn't normally in the business of running prizes. This is not what we do. So being the organization that we are, we have other objectives with the prize as well. We do want to identify innovation and recognize excellence, but most of all, we want to learn from leaders out there, and we want to connect that knowledge and those lessons to urban change makers. And so, with that being said, we hope to be a global and diverse prize, rigorous with a robust process, and we hope also to inspire action. We want to be inspirational in the sense not of aspirational, but inspirational, really catalyze action on the ground. We're still a young prize, so this is all a work in progress, and we're always happy to, with lots of you here in the audience today, we actually engage with on a one-on-one basis. So we're always looking to continue that conversation. I'm just going to give you the sneak peek of where we got submissions from in case you hadn't seen it yet. We had a great cycle. We just closed on February 15th, and we are in the middle of the evaluation. So stay tuned. We'll be announcing finalists probably in the end of June. So it'll be very exciting again, just from all over the world. It's looking really, really good. And a shout out to our advisory council, who is really the instrument for recommending the excellent projects. Some of you may even see yourselves on the map and on the pictures. So just thank you for recommending. In the past cycles, 8 out of 10 finalists were recommended by advisors. So it's we're actually building an advisor hall of fame. So stay tuned for that one. It's coming. So the three questions that bind this work together are actually kind of simple, but they're very complicated in answers. So what does urban transformation look like? You know, when we talk about systemic change, systems change, what does that even look like in cities, given that, you know, cities look different and it's contextual and it's multidimensional. So one of the things that's what we're looking to understand. The second one is, how does it happen? And this speaks to these, you know, different words, scaling, amplification dynamics, different processes by which individual projects or initiatives can become bigger than the sum of their parts. And then ultimately, how can we identify and grow these seeds of change, because we know that we need to act fast and time is running out. And so I think we'll touch on all of these today. As we started to unpack some of these questions, you know, very organically, we connected to some of the speakers today. And we've been wanting to explore the question that is central to this session individually. And then as the nature of cities was around the corner, we thought, well, how about we just get people together in a session, and then we can broaden the conversation beyond just kind of our small group. And so since I see quite a few people have joined, I'm very pleased that you also thought these are interesting questions. So I hope you can participate lively, use the chat. You know, we will also take comments and questions from the audience throughout the session. So these are our speakers. I'm not going to present them right now. I'm just going to sort of hand over in a second, but I just wanted to give you that overview. Each speaker has 5 to 10 minutes to present an example of their research that speaks to the questions. And then we'll have a little bit of time after each presenter to ask a clarifying question or, you know, or another question from between the speakers, since this started as a kind of an informal exchange. After that, we'll just have an open discussion. We have 90 minutes, so we can take all that time, or we can also decide to close out earlier. All up to us where this takes us. This is supposed to be flexible and pretty informal, just a stimulating discussion. So with that said, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Vipashi Ghosh from Sprue. If you would like to share your screen, you may do so.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? And slides are okay? Great. All right. So yeah, I'm going to present the project called Motion. And let me go to the next slide just to introduce who am I and what exactly I'm going to present. So the title is that I'm going to present the methodology that we have developed over the last few years in this project called Motion, which is about implementing transformative outcomes for accelerating systemic impact. So very much relevant to what Anne was saying. So my name is Vipashi. I am based at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex in Sprue in the UK. My research has been always on urban sustainability transitions, transformations, and I work in this project called Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium, which looks at transformative innovation. So I'm going to sort of also present some reflections from that transformative innovation policy methodology as well. So I'm going to present this on behalf of my colleagues. As you can see the names, so they were the main sort of Motion team, and I also have, I think, Jenny from the team in here. So yeah, we will try to sort of answer any questions you may have about the project or the methodology per se. So since this is about urban sustainability, Motion has Motion actually works with 3 case studies, but I thought I will focus on this particular case, which is called SUSMO, which is about sustainable urban shared mobility. So this is a project that we have worked with in order to, you can say, make it more transformative, think of systemic impact. So the project existed, it was funded by the Climate Kick, and the project is indeed about shared mobility systems along in the 4 cities. So we worked with city partners in Stockholm, Madrid, Bologna, and Sofia. And it is important to actually read out the goal of this project, because you will see that I have sort of highlighted the way they kind of present the goal. The goal of this project is to actually change the way sustainable mobility systems are implemented across Europe, and then also deliver a vision for cities to lead the way in decarbonizing the transport systems. So it is about changing the way, and it is also about a sort of vision for creation. So how do you actually change the way? So our entry point is indeed in this generic, what we call a generic theory of change, which comes from the sustainability transitions literature. If you're interested, you can look into this literature, which gives you a sort of a theory of change, which is about changing regimes. So you conceptualize systems as regimes, which are very stable systems. And the idea for making these systems more sustainable is to go from an old regime, which is undesirable, unsustainable, to an emerging regime, which is going to be more sustainable. And in order to do that, you have these niches. So niches are spaces where innovation happens. So these innovations, so the idea is to sort of create space for innovations to flourish, to kind of nurture and to accelerate. And there is also this idea of landscape pressure. So you have pressures like the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, you have pressures like climate change and the climate emergency. And also, issues like inequality and poverty, which are very, very prominent especially in urban contexts. So all these change happens under these pressures, in fact, trying to address some of these grand challenges. So this is our generic theory of change that we try to sort of implement while working with the project. But when you actually are sort of trying to think about the theory of change together with the city partners, you need to sort of, we use this sort of frame, this sort of different elements of the theory of change, like, you need to think about inputs, you need to think about activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. So this is a very conventional way of organizing a theory of change. So these are the elements, and then there are interconnections between these elements. So the idea, in order to sort of think of transformation in a city, the idea is to kind of take a step back and think about what is your existing theory of change. So what are the different inputs that you have? What are the different activities that you can do? With what outputs and what outcomes can you achieve? So you can see an example on your right that we worked with the city partners to think about, okay, what outcome? And you can do this from any starting point. So you can perhaps first try to sort of think of an outcome, and then think of what activities is needed in order to achieve that outcome, and then what activity will lead to what output, which will lead to an impact. So the main idea is that impact is in fact quite sort of a step forward. So I think there is an intermediary step between activity and impact, a systemic impact, and that is what we call to be an outcome. So we really think that in order to make transformation happen, we need to focus on outcomes and not immediately impacts, because impact will come through outcomes. So just as I said, so we sort of tried to sort of devise this framework called Transformative Outcomes. It is basically to say that our theory of change is informed by these transformative outcomes, which are basically leverage points. And these are leverage points for systemic transformation. And following our sustainability transitions theory, you can say that there are macro processes in which these leverage points can sit. So there is this macro process of building niches, and you have we have 4 transformative outcomes of building niches. And similarly, once you build niches, you want to mainstream those niches. And then there are transformative outcomes for mainstreaming those niches. Similarly, it's not enough just to build niches. It's also important to open up the regime. So because if the regime is stable, nothing will happen, even if you nurture enough niches. So it is really important to have transformative outcomes in order to open the regime, in order for these innovations to flourish. So you can read this paper. So I've given the source. I'm sure these slides will be distributed. So you can go into the paper and read more about these outcomes. But the idea is to actually mobilize these outcomes in co-creating a theory of change. So the idea is that we have a theory of change, of course, which these projects probably follow. Even before we intervened, the motion intervened. But as we sort of thought through these city partners in these 4 cities, we started to think about what are the different pathways through which these cities can go from activities to outcomes to impact. So for example, now in this infographic, you have 5 pathways, and this is the final output. Like this is the final infographic you're seeing. This is a very clean sort of version. It emerged through several workshops and several dialogues. But this is the final sort of output where you can see there are 5 different pathways. So there is a public and private collaboration pathway. There is a policy regulation pathway. There's a stakeholder engagement pathway, and so on. And within each pathway, so if you go from the center, you have the inputs. So the input is, for example, bringing together diverse stakeholders in a process of mutual learning and co-creation of tools. And from that center, you move out, you zoom out into thinking of activities, thinking of what are the different transformative outcomes. So in the circle, you read the different transformative outcomes. So they are navigating expectations, their circulation, learning, networking, and so on. And outside of that circle, you see the sort of different the different characterization of those outcomes. So what does navigating expectation mean in the case of sustainable shared mobility? And then you have the impact. So we say that we sort of try to co-create the outcomes, very locally contextual outcomes, following our transformative outcome framework. But as I said, this is the final infographic that you saw. And here I wanted to give you a glimpse of how actually co-creation happens. So you see, we have had many workshops.
You have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Anne. So we have had different workshops where we co-constructed these sort of input activities, outputs, and this is intensive collaboration along in many phases through which this theory of change emerged. And finally, so I think so basically the idea is once we have a sort of theory of change, a generic theory of change, you want to develop a transformative theory of change. So this is a kind of a canvas through which you can arrive at that final infographic that I showed. So you can think of your pathway, you can have your theory of change canvas. So this is all available in the Motion Handbook. You can use yourself to actually, in your cities, with your city partners, to think of your theory of change. But most importantly, then this is where you actually translate your outcomes into transformative outcomes. So we try to sort of match what outcomes you come up in your theory of change, and then what outcomes does it really mean in terms of transformative outcomes. But what I would end with is that it is not always enough to just identify which transformative outcomes are your cities achieving. So what we developed in the Motion project is a self-assessment tool of monitoring the quality of outcomes that you are achieving. So we are saying that once you achieve, say, navigating expectations, what does navigating expectations mean, and to what extent you are navigating expectations? That's the question we would like to explore. We wanted to explore with the city partners. So this is where you see a sort of a scale we see that, okay, there's a scale between very good to poor, and then you can apply this scale into thinking of to what extent these transformative outcomes are achieved and what inputs are needed, what are the areas of improvement in order to sort of stretch the quality of the transformative outcome. So this is also another tool that you can use, and it's available for the Miro link is available in the Motion handbook as well. Yeah, so I will end with this final sort of practical advice. This was one of the things I was thinking. So what you have seen so far is what we call a formative evaluation approach. So this is not this is different type of evaluation than a summative evaluation, where formative evaluation is about continuous monitoring through flexible tools. So it's not about evaluating at the end, it is about evaluating as we go through. So that is what is really important for transformative change to happen. And a second thing is that I think it's really important to think about engagements in terms of anticipating trends, not just solving today's problems, but also solving future problems, anticipate future problems and solve them. So I think that is where the core idea of transformation lies. It's in anticipation and futures literacy. With that, I will stop. And you can email me if you want to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Bipashi. That was great. You know, as someone who I basically carry your transformative outcomes paper with me, it's for real, because it's so good. This is incredible to see, and I really love the work that you're doing. It would be great if you could pop the link to the Motion handbook into the chat for everybody who's interested. We'll also collect slides afterwards if the presenters are open to sharing them. So the way we've organized it, that anybody can ask a question in the chat at any time. We've also asked each of the presenters to sort of ask a discussion question of their fellow presenters. So I'm going to take the first one. It's my honor to ask on behalf of Salome and my presentation, which is that, this is Motion's a very practical tool that you did through stakeholder engagements. And one of the things on our mind is, what did it take to get stakeholders that you were working with to think in systemic terms? So did they immediately get that they were sort of working towards a bigger theory of change, a bigger impact, or how did you approach that? Did you see that sort of shift happen when you were working with them?
Yeah, so I can start. Maybe Jenny also wants to jump in with her experience as well, because what I always seen in both Motion and the Transformative Innovation Policy, when we work with policy practitioners, the first step is always, before you even go into evaluation or building a theory of change, the first step is always a system mapping. So what is your system and what does a system constitute? What is a systemic problem? And sometimes this is also an opportunity to define an experiment, because we really think that it is important to think of an experimental space in order to do this kind of evaluation. So it's not a very traditional sort of evaluation. So this is formative, this is continuous monitoring. So you need a bit of an experimental mindset. So that's why you need to sort of, so the system mapping, the first maybe workshop is always about identifying the problem, where it sits in the system, who are the different actors, and what is the experiment, the boundary of that experiment. And that really creates that space for sort of exploring the system and a kind of a mutual understanding of a system before you can go into the theory of change or evaluation. I don't know if Jenny wants to say something else.
Yeah, maybe just a quick addition. So definitely one thing that we noticed when starting the collaboration with the partners was that it was really important to define what formative evaluation actually meant, and that basically it was not our job or our objective to come in and see what goes wrong or what goes right. So sort of to evaluate them in terms of success indicators or KPIs or things like that. But that our approach was very different from that, and that it was actually a lot about sort of reflecting about the processes and really making sure that we sort of stretch their understanding of the impact that they can actually generate with their project. And yeah, so especially in the beginning, sometimes we noticed that the understanding of formative evaluation differed quite a lot with the participants. So yeah, it was important for us to make sure that we make clear what it is that we're trying to achieve with the methodology.
Great, thanks so much. So getting all the stakeholders on the same page about key definitions and what this exercise entails, that's really useful. Thank you so much. So we'll come back to you in the discussion a bit later. I'm now going to pass it on to our second speaker, who is Harald Roacher from Linköping. Harald, please go ahead and share your screen.
So first unmute. Thanks so much. And I'll share in a second. So just some quick slides also, and also related to some projects we are doing here. So my name is Harald Roacher. I'm a professor of technology and social change here at Linköping University in Sweden. And there we are also, and I think it links nicely really into what Bibashi just presented on also transformative outcomes, formative evaluation, because that's it. We have drawn a lot also on her work and the work of the TIPSI consortium on transformative innovation policies. And we are working here in Sweden with quite a large number of cities, also in the context of the Viable Cities program. So that's a strategic innovation program in Sweden. I'll come back to that, and which is organized around a hub, which is called Transition Lab. And so that's here, that's a bit a combination of different projects. Part of this broader innovation program is also this Accelerera project, where this picture is drawn from, which is about transformative capacities of cities. So our approach is also very much about which capacities for such innovation processes do cities need to become climate neutral, for example, or to work with mission-oriented transformative innovation projects. So that's what we are working here, and that's what my work is related to a lot. So I have a background in social sciences, innovation research, and work a lot, have worked with sustainability transitions, transformative change, transformative innovation policies here in Sweden. Okay, so that's just a quick picture of, and here you also see one operationalization, so to say, of this transition theory, sustainability transitions theory of change, so to say, which this Viable Cities program in Sweden is using. And which, most of the steps most of you have seen, and it's closely related also to the one slide on the MLP and multi-level perspective, which Bibashi showed, which is very much about thinking about, so designing visions, thinking about urban futures, developing, pictures, versions of a sustainable futures in cities. It's about citizen engagement, with the knowledge also that there is no one who can implement, even if there are differences in power, also for sure in urban contexts, there's no actor who actually can implement such transformative change processes. That's always a distributed process. It's very much what in Viable Cities they call the deep code issues. So it's about institutional structural change processes, which are also important. It's about this collaboration of the different actors. It's about developing portfolios also of different options and projects, experimenting, and then learning and following up. And this learning and following up is also an issue which I want to put emphasis a bit here now in those few slides, and also in the way which Bibashi already said, that's actually not something which comes at the end, but that's actually something which needs to be integrated in the processes. Projects, transformative change even needs to be designed in a sense that you already have procedures, processes of reflection, learning, evaluation, monitoring as part of the whole process. So that's what in this context of this strategic innovation program, Viable Cities, is discussed and which we try out. So that's a mission-oriented program which runs for 12 years, just to give a quick information on this, and which has a broad portfolio of different projects for smart and sustainable cities. Budget of around 100 million euros over 12 years, but mobilizes actually a lot more. So that's one of the Swedish really signature programs which they have in urban climate change, urban low carbon transitions. And there have been 9 forerunner cities, and now in a second round, 14 additional cities, so 23 cities in Sweden, which have made various commitments to become climate neutral in 2030. For sure, you can ask now, okay, what do they mean by climate neutral? And that's not an obvious thing, but still they made this commitment. And there's this transition lab, which is, as I said, a hub where a joint learning and collaboration between those 23 cities and other actors in Sweden should take place. And in this Accelerator project, which I mentioned before, we build on those use or work with those 9 original cities in this climate neutral city program, and think about which capacities, capabilities do they actually need to achieve such and work with such change processes. Because as we already have heard, also this orientation towards mission societal challenges, it just changes the way also how municipalities need to work with innovation and change processes. It's much more than just knowledge generation. And it's an interesting question there, which capabilities, capacities are needed to govern transformative change. And that's what we try to do in this one project, where we together with cities develop tools, carry out workshops, develop education programs also from the universities to support cities in this transformation effort. And I'd like to, focus on this again last step, which actually is not the last, this following up evaluation very quickly. And at the case of climate neutral Linköping, so the city where I'm here and which is part of this broader program also, and where we look currently at also sustainable urban districts as transformative projects. So Anne and so you've called also in the description of this session, it's about transformative projects, which in itself is an interesting question. I think, how can a project which is time limited, which has distinct boundaries, in which respect can this be actually transformative? And then, are city districts projects, are city districts actually niches? Is even a question there, niches which would be much more oriented towards particular technologies or new configurations, and in a sense, so you have at least, if you say we work with city districts, these are you get a systemic level at least to work with at the city level, which is still smaller than the whole city. And these are just at the right side 2 examples here in Linköping about this working with this district level. The one is this so-called Vallastaden, where they tried new types of buildings, mobility concepts, and to bring this into and that's basically about 500 meters from here. So that's very close to the university district, which was built, and Ebbe Park that's below, where they tried to set up, and that's just under construction, but the first people are moving in to develop a city district as a test bed for various types of experiments and changes. But the question then is, again, how can we assess how transformative actually such districts or projects are? Which lessons can be learned looking into these, forerunner districts, which we're looking at here? The city knows surprisingly little, actually. They had broad ambitions and did very interesting things there, and had also transformative perspectives in a sense. So this should be a forerunner for becoming climate neutral. But if you then look how they are actually following up, how much they know about, to which extent they are achieving transformative changes, that's very little, and that's something where you have to build structures and infrastructures, also how to work with this. Also to ask, because this was also in the description, you know, what does scaling up actually mean if we talk about such a city district? It's certainly not just, you know, making it bigger. It also wouldn't mean that you just replicate it, because we know that all these processes are, you know, deeply contextualized and embedded. So they are very local often. So it's also an interesting question, which type of lessons can you actually, and that's what we try to work with the city here, but lessons can you actually then take over to new urban developments, or, you know, to the transformation of existing parts of the city. And which structures then do you actually need for following up, monitoring, learning, and so on, the competencies and skills, also the new organizational forms you would need in the city. Anne, I guess it's already getting close to the finish, so I'm just
we're getting there, yeah, but you can take
very fast. So that's basically what Bipashi already said. Also, you know, you have to move also then, if you think about monitoring and evaluation, from a ex post summative perspective to a more development oriented formative view, where it is a permanent process of learning and reflection and monitoring, which is the only way you can deal with such transformative problems and projects, which are wicked in the sense there are no simple solutions. There is no clear definition of success. They are long-term, you know, where you can ask, okay, when do outcomes then actually become visible? They are fragmented into many projects, which makes it difficult also to capture the indirect effects and say, okay, this project is actually the one which contributed to transformation, for example. And they are part of broader ongoing socio-political changes, where you also can ask, okay, who is then actually accountable for the change which we are seeing here? And that's just the last slide. You know, the work on also a formative evaluation processes, nicely what Bipashi already said before, you know, we also think you have to see this as a much more laborative experimental process also. So also the evaluation itself, the developing of criteria of, you know, how do you use narratives is in itself already a process of envisioning and reflection about, you know, where do you want to get and how do you want to get, you know, towards, for example, more climate neutrality. In the cities, you need a portfolio of different evaluation approaches, particularly when we talk to funders, they still, you know, are interested and need kind of more summative control-oriented evaluation of projects. But at the same time, you need this reflection, and you can ask, okay, how can you use synergies between these different types of evaluations? You need new tools also in terms of this permanent following up. There is, for example, a very interesting, the small wins framework, which has been used in the Netherlands. So a kind of radical incrementalism where you look at incremental steps which are made, but in this broad transformative context. And it's about, to conclude with this last point, really building infrastructures, structures for evaluation and learning, which are built into projects really from the beginning. So you have to think about, you know, how can you achieve transformation, and how can you understand that you are in a process of transformation already in the design and setup of the project, I think. Okay, thanks so much. That's just a quick glimpse into some of the things we are working here in Sweden with viable cities and sustainable cities here in Sweden. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Harald. And I don't know if your paper is now available. I know when I was reading it, it was in draft form or in peer review. It's one of those papers that made parts of my mind sing. You know, it was just reflecting on the nature of evaluation and how we can even think of individual initiatives in part of this multidimensional in architecture and all these external factors. And I think it picked up all these different points really nicely. So thank you for presenting that. And if there's a way of sharing it with participants, maybe they can just email you if they're interested.
Yeah, please. It's under revision, so it's just hopefully, you know, in a few months we can deliver it.
I'm going to hand it over to, I think Bipashi was going to be our fellow panelist who was going to ask you a question. And I see we also have one in the audience as well.
Yeah, so quickly, I think I really thank you for that presentation, Harold. I really appreciate, you know, there's so much resonance with our work. We should definitely talk more. But I was wondering, because you did mention about capacities, and that's what we always struggle with in the consortium, but also in motion, sort of the sort of organizational capacities, especially in public sector, in municipalities, and how that affect the process of learning, process of actually engaging in the long term that we need for formative evaluation to happen. So is there any sort of learning, any sort of highlights that you can pick up and share, just so we understand the sort of connection between what sort of capacities are required for this formative evaluation, reflexive learning process to happen?
Yeah, I mean, at least that's what we try when we work with cities, for example, and do workshops with them to you know, and that's, I think, always a nice insight which cities get then also, and where the capacities perspective is interesting, I think. So when they try to develop visions of, you know, how to become more sustainable, and then, you know, then you discuss with them, you know, on the one hand, you know, this vision orientation, you know, thinking about different options for the pictures of the future, also the different tools to work with that, but then also to get what you also said, you know, the systemic understanding. So I think these are already examples for these types of capacities, in a sense, which cities need, and where they need to, you know, also develop processes, how they, for example, can systematically work with, you know, futuring, with future images, which they, you know, it does come up. It's related often to city branding and such things. But in terms of transformation processes, or, you know, all the, what you discussed, and I tried to bring in, you know, these different types of evaluations. So I think just at this processual level, or working with, you know, transformative outcomes, is what we then often refer to as a, you know, capacity in terms of the organizational structures which need to change, you know, how you know, develop a different way of collaborating, for example, in the city, but then also how this is filled actually with, you know, actual, you know, action, and people need then also capabilities and competencies to work with that. But that's often an eye-opener for, you know, when we work with municipal leadership, for example, when they start to understand that they actually need different types of procedures and ways of thinking to achieve such transformative change.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very helpful. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm going to pass it on to Lauren. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi. I studied urban sustainability and sustainable urban development, so I'm kind of familiar with the sustainable city. And after reflecting a little bit on the concept of sustainable cities, and also in the context of this presentation, I noticed some discomfort about the progress and growth narrative that's very prevalent in this sustainable city kind of discourse. And I find it a little bit troublesome, because part of that necessity for growth, I think, comes from also some settler colonial mentality. And how do you integrate degrowth in the concepts of transition when you know that the transition is crucial and needs to happen, while also respecting that this is a structural framework, a cultural, social framework that is also deeply problematic. Was that clear? It's a little bit emotive, but I think it's quite important to discuss.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, and it is definitely an important point, you know, and how to bring, you know, and the kind of the dilemma, the challenge is, you know, that to get them even on a kind of pathway or a project, you know, which deals with climate change, climate neutrality is already, for them quite a stretch often. But to talk about, degrowth and different cultural framings, I think the important thing, and at least, for example, those cities or many of the cities we are working with start to think about, questions of degrowth. I haven't, well, the limits, or at least where they understand that, the overemphasis on growth orientation, that's certainly a problem for most of them, but they start to think more about questions of justice, social sustainability. So that's actually what they want to connect. So I think, this, providing a platform for such broader discourses and types of interaction, I think brings in often such voices which are very critical towards, these dominant growth models, which those cities very often follow. So I think this opening up is at least at the same time also an opening for bringing in voices which otherwise at least are even less heard, in the urban change process. So I don't really have an answer. I do see the problem also, and I think, these platforms and opening up this urban change processes at least helps to articulate such questions more than before.
Thank you. Yeah, it's important that we're aware of where we are situated, not just in the global north, but also in this point in time, anthropogenic time. And so, yeah, potentially it's a question about what kind of qualitative data can you include, right, about the well-being that's not related to the smart city or growth framework as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for your question, and Harald for your thoughtful response. I also want to point, to, I think certainly no one's answered the degrowth question and how to incorporate that into, these multi-stakeholder dialogues. I will say there might be an interesting answer at the International Sustainable Transitions Conference, where scholars are getting together. I'll pop the link in the chat. It happens every year since sort of 12 years now. And it's kind of where scholars who are interested in these similar questions that we're discussing today get together to discuss some of the frontier topics, which I think this really is. I think it's a really, really hard discourse to reconcile with sort of more mainstream approaches. So I'll try and find the link and pop that into the chat. It's actually really a great conference to check out for other reasons too, because it will be the first sort of virtual multi-decentralized conference, which will have sort of 3 geographical locations in Melbourne and, do you remember, Harald, in Washington?
South Africa,
Stellenbosch, I think, as well as virtual. So I think it will be an interesting experiment in conferencing, but you might also find some sessions that focus specifically on these topics. So let me, oh great, thank you, Bipashi just popped it into the chat. So just in the interest of time, I know there's another hand raised. If it's okay, Neho, we're going to move to the next speaker, but please, if you'd like to type your question in the chat or reserve it for after all speakers have gone, then we would love to hear from you either verbally or written. So it's my pleasure to pass the word to Salome Gongadze, who is my colleague at the World Resources Institute. Salome, please take the word and share your screen. Salome, I don't know if you are speaking, but we can't hear you.
Yep, just the classic mute myself on accident thing. Anyway, hi everyone. I'm so excited to present with you guys sort of our take on some of these questions. That's actually part of the prize team at WRI. But just a little bit of context about me. So I work with Anne. I'm evaluation and engagement specialist with the prize, which means I basically do a lot of different things in terms of both delivering the prize and helping run our evaluation process to make sure that the winner is the most deserving and impactful project, but also I've sort of done different kind of research projects where we're taking some of the things we're learning about the prize, different applicants, and kind of like answering bigger urban questions to them. So just to get started, in terms of the objective of our project, the overarching objective is similar to some of the other ones that you've heard about today. So we are seeking to support urban change makers in amplifying their projects' initiatives for greater impact beyond the project boundary. So basically, how can we support people who are interested in taking small change and making it into bigger change? And then our final product, so our project is actually just started. We're going to be writing it this year, but it'll be a guidance that'll be aimed at different kind of implementers of urban projects, so like some of the ones who apply for the prize. In terms of just a little bit of an overview, again, the prize for cities, like we mentioned before, is an award for projects that achieve inclusive and sustainable urban transformation all over the world. In this project that we're working on, we basically what we aim to do is look at the prevailing literature concerning systems change in cities, and then synthesize them into a framework that we're then going to use to analyze a subset of projects that submitted the prize for cities. So we have this very unique, interesting data sample that we use for this project. In terms of kind of what are the general contributions of knowledge is, we're kind of addressing gaps in terms of transformative capacity. So like, how much change can actually happen, trying to better understand what transformation means in cities, and also then helping to measure and implement these kind of projects. In terms of the prize itself, to try to explain why we're doing this is, our main goal is to be a platform to celebrate research and thought leadership on urban transformation, and to award a project every single year, something really impactful. Part of that is also we have this expanded knowledge agenda, which basically means like what I was talking about before. We want to use our knowledge resources to create products that will benefit urban practitioners and advance understandings of urban transformation. So that's kind of our goal and kind of the strategic context that we're kind of working in. In terms of getting started with the actual sort of academic and research context that we're working in is, firstly, we have what's called this transformative turn in urban scholarship. So, if you're familiar with this work, that's this recognition that sustainability challenges are systemic problems and they need transformative solutions. So we can't just change small stuff. We sort of have to transform entire systems to sort of align cities on these new sustainable trajectories through transformative projects. So transformative projects are what we've mentioned before. They're these interventions that provide entry points that create chain reactions, ripple effects beyond the project boundary, basically. So a project that achieves a lot more than they kind of set out to do and creates new innovations beyond it. So that's kind of what we want to see. We have this recognition of this thing, but there's also, I think amongst us a recognition that we don't often see these major transformations. They're really hard to get. For different reasons. We don't see a lot of evidence of transformative capacity on the ground, and that is supported by the literature, but it's also, you can probably think for yourself in terms of your own knowledge and recognize that what we're talking about is a relatively rare occurrence in practice. But the good news is it does happen. We are uniquely placed to explore this concept because we're a prize that awards transformative projects. We will provide you with ways to learn more about the prize through our exhibit Nature of Cities, and also we'll be linking to some of our resources. But you can see in the the 5 finalists for the 2 years that we've done the prize, actual projects that have gone from these small changes to really transform cities. So that's kind of how we find our where we fit in, is like we have all this great knowledge about urban transformation, and we also understand what's needed. So how can we kind of help improve that knowledge? So that's kind of the first part of it. I've sort of situated us in this analytical milieu. So I will then turn to talking a little bit about the ways that other people have described transformative processes and how we're going to be synthesizing some of them into our own framework. So our framework is we wanted to study how other people are doing it, and we are relying on sort of a synthesis of two existing frameworks, two excellent pieces of work that basically both focus in exploring how transformative processes can be enabled. How does change happen? Obviously, I'm very excited to sort of be on this virtual stage with Dr. Ghosh, and who's worked on this project. That's one of the ones working at. So she can jump in at any time to kind of add in if I'm sort of characterizing her work in any way. So the first one that we looked at, or that we really liked, was it's called Scaling the Impact of Sustainability Initiatives, a Typology of Amplification Processes. So basically, this is a paper 2020 that focuses on creating a typology of amplification processes. They use this word amplification process. It basically means the way that sustainability initiatives increase their impact. And they look at how they grow. So they have different ways of describing growth, whether that's upward growth into new policy domains, or growth into impacting new new rules and legislation. So that they study them, and I'll be linking to these in the chat later. The second one we've heard about is the Transformative Outcomes from the Transformative Outcomes Policy Consortium. You've heard about this project already, but basically this paper is building on sustainability transitions research, and it's introducing these transformative outcomes, which are basically descriptions of how niche innovations can grow and become mainstreamed in the policy space. So I think I've tried to demonstrate the way that these two frameworks kind of do similar things. We see them as complementary and comprehensive. They cover similar processes. And in our final written product, we'll be describing these two processes, these two frameworks, and thinking about the ways that we synthesize them in a way that works best for the urban context. So in terms of the methodology for our paper, what I've mentioned before, the first part of the project is a literature review, where we're going to look at those frameworks I just described. We'll also be looking at literatures concerning systems change in cities. And we kind of want to be highlighting that there's this increasing level of complexity in achieving impact, then systems change, then urban transformation as the kind of highest, most transformative type of impact. Then we will do some of our work in our data analysis. So basically, this is where I'm going to talk about our project samples. So we have what we call the Prize for Cities database of entries. So basically, that's give or take about 400 written applications from people who applied for a prize. And they're just these written papers, and they describe what the project is, where it was, how it occurred over time, and how it impacted different things. And the cool thing about this is we don't only just have these, we also have analysis of each project, because when we are evaluating them in order to pick the winner, we have this multidisciplinary expert evaluation team who are urban experts who work here with us at the World Resources Institute, and they basically read every single application, and they will score each application on different dimensions of impact. And specifically, we ask them to rank projects on ripple effects. So to give a score, how much this project has created these impacts in other domains. And then that is what we can use to pick the projects we want to study for this project. We'll be collecting all of the scores that we have, and from there we'll take a subset of the projects that score the highest for transformation. So that way we'll have this sample. We're not quite sure how many it'll be, maybe about 50 for this kind of higher level data analysis, where we can quickly describe what kind of ripple effects are occurring in every single project. And after that, after we have that kind of quick coding process, we then do a deeper dive into a subset of cases. There'll probably be some of the finalists. It'll depend on kind of what we unearth in our data analysis, but we'll basically be looking at the relationship between different amplification processes, looking at actors and agency, the interaction between different processes, and also basically all the things that we're going to be identifying in our framework. And after that, we'll be presenting our findings, and we will then, formulate a recommendation for project implementers, and kind of basically be using our case studies to demonstrate how our framework is useful for people who want to actually study their own work. So that is kind of the general overview of our project as we've conceptualized it right now. In terms of things I would love to hear from some of the audience or some of my co-presenters would be, as part of our final project, it's in line with the WRI principles of impact and our own interest in trying to get policymakers to actually, think more systemically. We want this to be a practitioner-focused work rather than something very abstract. So, we know some of you guys have worked with practitioners, and you have views about the best ways to reach them, the best way to communicate with them. I'd love to hear a lot about some more about the best way we can orient ourselves to make that effective. And we'll be, just to kind of close out, definitely check out our website as well, our Twitter, and also we'll be giving you information about how to access an interactive exhibit of some of our prize finalists and winners right here in Topia as part of Nature of Cities Festival.
Thanks, Salome. And I love that you end by asking questions. Absolutely, it would be great to hear from everyone on some of these questions, or indeed any other questions that you'd like to ask. First, however, it's time for someone to ask you a question. So I was wondering if Jordi, who is also our next presenter, who you haven't heard from yet, if you would like to ask Salome a question.
So I do have a question about perhaps the examples of the typology you presented. I mean, this idea of a typology of transformative change, I think, is a very attractive one. It'd be great if, and maybe it's too soon, right? I'm not sure at what stage. It sounds like you're working through the data set, and I see this wonderful opportunity that WRI has to do this work. Now it all sort of starting to make sense how uniquely positioned you are to really shed some insight on these big questions. So it's really very exciting. But I don't know if you could provide any examples of the typology and maybe a transformative change that you have in mind. Or if you don't want, if that is not of your interest, I also see that there is another one in the chat. So I'll let you take your choice. Actually, there's another one coming in as well, but maybe if you could quickly just comment on the typology, that'd be great.
Fabulous. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I can speak. By the way, Anne is my co-writer on this paper, and she should feel welcome at any time to say things as well. I'll take two points, your own, and I see an interesting comment here about different applications of cities around the world, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So firstly, yeah, we are still developing like the synthesis that we actually want to achieve. I think what we had kind of in our notes, our discussion, which aren't showing up because of the background thing, is basically both of these frameworks study like phases in a project, if that makes any sense. So sometimes when it's an idea that's growing within its own domain, and then an idea that is then from there like amplifying out to other areas, and then from there one idea that will then change entire relationships. So one of our winner last year was Rosario, which is in Argentina. It's an amazing project about urban agriculture. And we see in the way we study how their projects developed over time, they have this initial first agricultural project that's response to this short-term food security problem they were having like 2 decades ago. And then from there was this, so there's this small way where they're incubating the idea that we can do urban agriculture and it should be something we should be trying to do more. And then from there, you have these expanded programs, and then eventually you reach this point where it's this city that has this really multi-dimensional way in which food security issues are being dealt with by growing their own food kind of more locally. So that's kind of, it'll be focused on those kind of stages. I'm hoping I'm saying that right, and you have to definitely hop in. I think also just to mention in terms of applying where we're studying, I mean, there's definitely recognition in the literature. I think this question is from Tuba, about that a lot of this work is focused on, Western Europe, North America. But I think the cool thing about the prize is actually most of our winners are in the global South. So both of our winner was Dar es Salaam first year, and then there was Rosario. So we are definitely going to be incorporating a really diverse set of perspectives and highlighting the way that people in parts of the world that don't get a lot of attention for these things are actually doing some of the most amazing work, for sure.
Thanks, Salome. I think you did a great job answering those questions. So the only thing I'll add is that we kind of see some of the data that we have available, which is unique and very biased in its own way, as one way of starting to talk to the theory that is out there. So some of these frameworks of amplification processes and transformative outcomes, and just see which ones of these processes do we see at work in the data set that we are looking at. And so, these are essentially applicants who they themselves say that they have somehow been transformative in some way. Our evaluators have assessed to what extent, some more than others, according to our evaluators. And now we can come on top of that and sort of layer an analysis that says, for the ones that have been transformative, especially in this category of ripple effects, so beyond their boundary, to what extent are they actually featuring some of these processes that we see very, highly sort of recognized in the literature, which, the literature itself builds on sort of 20 years of research, theorizing and empirical research. So it's sort of a conversation that we're trying to bring down to a really practical level in the end, to say, from this synthesis between the literature and our data set, this is what we want to say to urban change makers, or this is what we hope we can say, and hopefully it is something helpful. But that's, I guess, the journey that we're sort of embarking on. There are some great questions in the chat. I'm wondering, we have sort of 20 minutes, so we can take one of these questions. I'm wondering if either Naho or Tuba, would you like to ask your question? You're also welcome to save it for later, but you're very welcome to answer it now. I'd rather not paraphrase it because I think they're very rich questions.
Hello. So may I speak?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Naho. I posted a question in the chat, and then my question is to everybody, not specifically to one speaker. But yes, when we are trying to design a new process for us to shift from our old pattern to the new regenerative, sustainable way of living, I think it is crucial to include a sense of time, or the notion of time, when we cannot slow down our process. Even if we implement or introduce a very fascinating new process, we have to follow these yearly, annual, fiscal cycle for budgeting, decision making, permission process, and we have to do this from this to this. That's why we cannot do the extensive ecological site study, etc., or we cannot have time to spend time with the people. Then it won't change, and then the earth cannot regenerate. So how would you, as experts in your fields, include the time of the notion of time in your model, which is, I think, difficult because model tends to be in 2D graphic, on the paper or on PDF, and then how can we include that?
Wow, what an excellent question. How do you incorporate time in the different models that we're working on? Time being very relative and contextual. So I'm wondering who of the panelists would want to take that. I can, Vipashi, I was thinking that maybe you want to take that. Great, thank you.
That's a very, very interesting question. I tend to think about it a lot, especially because I come from Global South. And I know that one of the challenges when we go and try to sort of do collaboration, it's always the challenge that, how can we get to immediate outputs? So I think that's a very, very relevant challenge, very relevant question to think about, especially in context of formative evaluation that Harold and I were talking about, because this takes definitely more time, and it takes a lot of lot of commitment to do this sort of evaluation. But my answer to that question, I mean, my intermediary answer, not a full substantive answer, is that I think there is also a need. So in my other project, which is called a Deep Transitions Project, and we are trying to work with investors, both private and public investors. So there are people from public sector investment communities joining us in terms of collaborating in thinking of how to transform the investment community and investment strategies around transformation. And there, I think what we are trying to get at is that the whole idea of the end result, this financial cycle, the fiscal cycle and the financial year, what you will achieve at the end of the financial year, is something that we can try to question and modify. So instead of saying that we need to get to a certain, say in terms of accounting for through GDP rise or through the sort of impact in terms of distribution effect, or impact through in terms of sort of certain amount. So you can, the sort of KPIs can differ, right? So we are saying that maybe one of the things to think about is to think of intermediary outputs. So you can say that there are certain deliverables at the end of a financial year, and we are basically thinking long-term. So the financial community is also trying to think long-term. So when you have a 5-year strategy, what you can deliver in 1 year, what you can deliver in 2 years, what you can deliver in 3 years, you create that plan, you create a pathway towards that 5-year strategy. So in the end, the pressure to deliver is indeed very intermediary. So it could be about, so in the consortium, in the Transformative Innovation Consortium, which was a 5-year project, every year we started to think of, every year we had certain deliverables, certain tangible outputs coming out of these reflective learning process, this collaborative workshops, the transformative outcomes, whatever we are doing with the cities. So at the end of the year, the output is not, I don't know, having 100,000 sharing bikes implemented in a city. The output is that a certain level of, say, for stakeholder engagement, we have engaged with and we have collaborated with 20 different organizations, and that's the first year. That's the output for first year, and that leads to the second year's sort of deliverables and the third year's deliverables. So yeah, it's important to sort of rethink what you can deliver in terms of time in order to do transformation. I don't know if it makes sense. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I would propose that we move to our final panelist. Once you're ready, Jordi, you have the floor. And then please have your questions ready for afterwards. If we go over time and we want to continue the conversation, we can also continue the conversation either here or in another space. Jordi?
All right, great. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, speakers. It's been really fascinating to hear about this very ambitious agenda, a very ambitious conversation that is taking place on ripple effects and deep urban transitions. I feel like I'll be taking this conversation in a slightly different direction. I'd like to, both speakers or several speakers have mentioned the word urban experiments. I use that term in a slightly different context. I'm an urban planner and academic, and my research has been on impact evaluation. And so I look more at the project scale, and I haven't thought as much about the systemic changes that many of you have. But I hope we can find a way to see how our different approaches can complement each other, and so we can work together for systemic change. So I'd like to focus my this presentation on urban experiments and what I mean by that. So briefly, this is my life on a timeline. I grew up in California and have lived, spent time in Europe and Mexico and Canada. I'm currently have an academic position at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. And I'm been here for just under a year, setting up a research group that's looking at formal experimentation and impact evaluation in cities. So urban experiments is a term that's used a lot, very frequently. My argument in this presentation is just that urban experimentation is something that is not done very often in a formal sense. But if planners and academics were to formally experiment, we could generate stronger evidence about how urban interventions, policies, and programs make their impact, right? So we're really narrowing in at the project level, trying to look at causal impact through urban experimentation. So until now, mostly we've been using the term experiments in an informal sense, right? It's sort of doing something new or doing something different, which is really very important, of course. But I'd also propose that they're formal experiments that urban planners could also conduct or think about conducting. That is really not part of the discussion. Often we use urban experimentation in an informal sense, and my research agenda has been trying to push us to think experimentally when we often planners do not in this formal way. So the informal experiments I think have been discussed. This is the block informal experiment in Barcelona that I'm more familiar with, but I'm sure many of you have seen many informal experimentation. As I mentioned, I'm interested in formal urban experiments, which I would define as systematic interventions for learning, in which we aim to test a particular intervention. We have some sort of element of randomization and a comparison group. And those two key elements, randomization, comparison groups, is really what makes an experiment a formal experiment. The advantages of doing this, I'm sure you're all very familiar with why we experiment. Is to have better evidence of program impact, to understand why programs work, not just if they do, but why, what are the mechanisms, generate evidence, and potentially even help us from investing in programs that are not very useful. So this is really common in many fields, but for some reason, perhaps because of the planning curriculum or architectural curriculum, experimentation is rarely part of the methodological approach used in our respective fields, and I'd like to work to change that. I've often been told, oh, you can't experiment. We work on with the cities, with plans. The conversation until now has been about systemic change. It's very difficult to experiment if you're working at such large scale. But I propose that there are opportunities to experiment if we look through that lens and see them. And I'd like to just present two very quickly. One, we did a public life experiment in which there was a community that was against densification near a university. They were fearful of new people coming to the neighborhood and what the impact on public life might look like. So we actually experimented and we added pedestrians into a corridor to see how that changed the perceptions of public space. So we artificially, on treatment hours, added pedestrians students walking up and down the corridor. We interviewed individuals, or we conducted surveys rather, on perceptions with and without, and we found that while it is correct that the quality of the public space diminished slightly, the increase in pedestrian traffic only slightly reduced the overall quality of public space. Also in the realm of facilitation and stakeholder engagement, planners do a lot of this work with communities, and often the approach used is often uncertain as to what the outcomes may be. We've all gone to public engagement events in which when we've walked out of it, we felt very unsatisfied about whether or not we were listened to or whether we're going to actually make the difference we want to make. And so what we did in collaboration with UNDP in Panama, we did a paired randomization in a stakeholder workshop where we randomly put similar individuals with similar profiles into two rooms. They did the same activity, but one had a very open facilitation style and another had a very structured facilitation style. And we found that indeed structured facilitation increased the likelihood that those who participated, they felt listened to, they felt that it was fair, they were happy with how participated. So those are just two examples of how planners, urban thinkers might introduce formal experiments into their work. I'd like to share one final example in a little bit more detail, because while it's not an experiment, it does have the opportunity for more systemic change. And this program that I'm working on to help evaluate is being run by the city of Barcelona. And it's essentially a school streets program that's called Protegemos Escolas. And it's motivated by issues of child safety around schools. When a 5-year-old child was killed in a school when coming out of school in 2019, the mayor took this very seriously and elevated this program to a top priority to implement as many school streets and to protect and transform the streets around as many schools as possible in Barcelona. It's important mentioning that this has been pushed by citizens and parents who are eager to calm the streets around schools to make them safer and to reduce noise, reduce the noise and improve the sound quality, and also to reduce air pollution. And so there's every Friday one Friday a month, there's essentially a movement of parents in Barcelona who are taking the streets. This Friday, there'll be another one. More than 30 schools around the city will occupy the streets, do tactical urbanism interventions. Actually, the most of these pictures are from the school where my daughter now goes, where kids and parents are taking it upon themselves to transform the streets outside their schools if the city has not granted them a school streets program. And these are major thoroughfares, so we're not just fun and games. They're cutting every Friday. They'll cut traffic on major thoroughfares in the city to push for safer and healthier streets. So that was the informal push, but the formal program looks a little bit like this. It has basically street calming interventions, some reductions of lanes, sometimes reducing, cutting off traffic entirely, although the intervention varies by school. So each project looks a little bit different. My involvement, they inquiring if I would help them with the school evaluation, with the evaluation of the program, and I accepted only when I got convinced the evaluation would be genuine and that they would be willing to listen to what the impact might be. And the ground we collected data on pre-intervention for the 2021 cohort 1 year ago, and in a few months we're going to do post-intervention. So pre-post, but of course we have control groups or control schools in order to have a more rigorous evaluation. And the city has invested 12.8 million euros in this. So this is a map just to give you a sense of where the 2021 cohort schools are in pink, and the lines are the air quality of the street network. So you can see in the Champla grid in the center of the cities where air quality is worse. And unsurprisingly, the city is starting with schools where air quality is actually much better in the periphery, but they're slowly working to get to the priority schools there in the center. Here you can get a little bit of a sense of what the transformation looks like, where they're getting rid of parking and vehicle traffic and adding in public elements. We're going to be studying the use of public space, and we're also going to be looking at air quality measures. I'm going to quickly flip through a few examples. This is one of the schools that we're studying. We'll be doing post measurements in May, looking at how people use the public space and who's using it by age and gender. Another one of our example schools in Sams, and another example. This one was quite beautiful and quite nicely done. So we do have a theory of change. I'm glad that was raised. We have a theory of change for how the transformation may lead to reduced or improved air quality, and also for our public life. We have a theory of change to specify how it may improve the quality outside the school. So this is just a visual of the heat map of where people are using the public space in our pre-intervention, and we'll be doing the same map in the post-intervention, so we can see the transformations, how people actually use the space. So we don't have specific results until maybe I'd be happy next year to share what we find. But the key part is that we're designing it with a pre-post and with treatment control, so that we can have specific outcomes, measurable outcomes on how this program has transformed the use of public space and air quality. So I want to go to the question that Anne asked us, what do we mean by impact? And I think here perhaps we also have different use of the term, and I'm using impact in a very narrow sense, sort of causal outcome framework. Impact is causal evidence and the outcome was a result of an urban intervention. That's sort of the very narrow focus that I'm looking at. And how does this fit in with the transformative change discussion, which I think is fascinating and urgent and needed. But I do see there is some tension, right, between how urban experiments and this approach has a very narrow reductionist perspective, but it may not have the other sort of qualitative or other dimensions that is also needed, other sort of data that's also needed to support transformative change. And then I'm wondering if, how might the tension between sort of this evidence-based approach versus the transformative change approach, is there a tension there? Might the demand for evidence constrain projects aiming for transformative change? I could see that. I could envision that tension existing. Could also go the other way around. Might the demand for transformative change constrain projects to aiming to generate experimental evidence of a particular urban intervention, right? So do we need to build the small pieces before building the house, or do we go straight to building the big systemic change? But ultimately, I think that the question that joins these different perspectives is the last one: how might urban experimentation be used to support transformative change? And I think that would be a place where we're all rowing in the working to generate evidence that particular interventions can eventually lead to these ripple effects that were mentioned earlier. So I'll leave it with that, and thanks again for welcoming me to this conversation.
Thank you, Jordi. Wow, what a great presentation. Really great. The experimental approach really reminds me of the Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, what they did, to economics a while ago. And it's great to see the approach being trialed and tested in urban design, which, has arguably even more sort of open boundaries as economics, which is already, far from the laboratory. We will have to continue the conversation another time. I have so many questions for you, but I'll pass it on to one of your fellow presenters who, having now heard both your presentations, they actually complement each other really, really well. So I'm very curious, Harold, what you're going to ask Jordi.
Yeah, thanks, Jordi. Really, fascinating presentation, I think, and thought-provoking also. Also, the question you asked then at the end, or the starting point, in a sense, I think, which is also very true, that the way experimentation is often talked about and treated in transformative change is, very sloppy in some sense, or you don't become very specific often. And the fascinating question which you raised yourself is, in a sense, how can you use this more causal evidence-based random trial types of formal experimentations as part of these broader change processes, which I don't think is necessarily a contradiction. But it's really a great point then to make. But how would you say, because and so I would see the way you formal experiments, that's kind of a subset of a broader class of experimentation then, but how would you draw the limitations? So what's the preconditions to make such formal experiments? Is this a specific type of intervention which is needed, or is it, because basically also those people participating don't, they should not know whether they are in the experiment or in the control group, all those questions which come up if you formalize this experimentation. And unfortunately, I'll have just, as soon as you have answered, I have to leave because somebody else is waiting for me in another meeting already. Thanks so much, Jordi.
Yeah, well, thank you. There are definitely limitations to the experimental approach or formal experiments. The ones, the logistics, getting them off the ground, they're very difficult to do. And I think the mistake would be to create some sort of antagonistic, relationship. The idea would really be to see how we can work together. I mean, my take is that urban planners don't think experimentally. Architects don't think in the full sense, right? We don't think so. Suspect that there are probably more opportunities to integrate experiments into our work. As I gave the example on public engagement, the example on public life. The school program could have been, there could have been some experimentation, formal experimentation done there. I don't think we need experiments to move us forward. I mean, it's not the only way. We shouldn't wait to have the slam dunk evidence base for every project. But on the other hand, there are so few experiments done that it can't possibly be that in our portfolio of evidence that we only have just 3, 4, 5 formal experiments in the entire field of urban planning, right? So we need to do much more than what we're doing, and when there are projects that look at the bigger picture and they're trying to make transformative change, it would be wonderful to see how we might insert formal experiments in that work through the engagement process, through the selection process. Again, it's not the only way to. There's just opportunities there that I think that are not being acted upon.
Thanks.
So everyone, we're just slightly over time, so I want to respect everyone's commitment, and thank you so much for joining. Please drop off as as you need to go. We'll be hanging out for a few more minutes just to see everyone off. Please also come and find us in the prize in the Topia space. We have if you find the WRI logo, or like by I think the North meeting rooms, you can click on a tree and like come and see us, or just write to us. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll share materials as a follow-up with everyone. Thanks. And if you want to hang out and chat with us, feel free to do that too.
Thank you, Anne, for organizing such a wonderful session.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Thanks.